Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ultimate Fashion History series, Speaking of Fashion, a little series of short videos aimed at new fashion students, sort of a bit like Fashion History 101, based on questions that my own freshman students often ask me. One of the things that often confuses all of my fashion students is the difference between fashion in the early 60s, fashion in the mid-60s, and fashion in the late 60s. And so this little video will hopefully clear up and identify the very different fashion looks that make up this stylish decade. Fashion in the early 60s was really just an extension of the fashion ideas we saw in the 50s. Very boxy skirt suits and shift dresses in simple but quite bright colors with slim skirts. This, of course, is an extension of the Chanel cardigan suit idea. The early 60s, 60 to 63, it was the era of Jackie Kennedy, but also the new look continued into the early 60s, but with a slightly more conical shaped skirt. From 1964 through 66, we see the British invasion and that high mid-60s mod look. Mary Quant was the designer who really vanguarded this look. Very childlike, very bold, a lot of fun. It was the era of Twiggy, but also the space age influenced fashion during this mid-60s period with lots of metallics and strange new textiles. And then in the late 1960s, we see nostalgia as the overarching fashion theme. Edwardian nostalgia, Victorian nostalgia, the maxi skirt came in, paisley prints, and Indian influences too. This really is the era of Janis Joplin. And the whole look was romantic and nostalgic. It's what a lot of people call the hippie look, even though, as I always tell my students, it wasn't just hippies who dressed like this. Everyone who was young and into fashion dressed this way in the late 1960s, regardless of whether or not they had dropped out of society. Young menswear. Let's use the Beatles as our guide. In the early 60s, young men still wore suits and thin ties. In the mid-60s, there was a loosening up of fashion rules with more individuality coming in. And by the late 60s, of course, the Beatles had embraced long hair and Indian influences and nostalgic influences. Let's look at hair for ladies. In the early 1960s, it was very stiff still, with a lot of these atomic shapes like the flip hairdo and the bouffant. You've all seen the movie Hairspray. This is the era of hairspray and these incredibly sculpted and sprayed hairdos. In the mid-60s, the loose geometric bob became popular due to Vidal Sassoon, the very famous hairdresser. If women didn't have a short geometric bob, this was a popular hairdo, just flat on top and loosely hanging, but with bangs, again, really trying to get this childlike look that was so popular in this era. And then, of course, in the late 60s, long and or natural hair, of course, was the ideal. Makeup in the early 1960s, it really was just the same idea as 50s makeup with the cat eye and false eyelashes. But then in the mid-1960s, although the false eyelashes still continued, we get the very Twiggy-like, childlike round doll eye and pale lip. And then if you want to play around with makeup ideas in the late 1960s, this is when you have all of this face painting, although girls at the trendier end of the spectrum had already started moving into the Deco revival and had started doing a slightly more 1920s smudgy makeup. I think the reason that my own freshman students get so confused about 60s fashion is because this looked so different to this, which looks so different to this. One of my pet peeves is when students tell me that hippies come from the 70s. Of course they don't. Hippies come from the 60s. But because fashion moved so quickly in the 1960s, they often confuse this sort of eclectic, nostalgic, slightly Indian influenced look of the late 60s with the gypsy peasant look of the 1970s, which we all know was a very different fashion moment. I hope this episode of Speaking of Fashion on the Ultimate Fashion History has helped clear up the confusion about the 1960s. But of course, on the Ultimate Fashion History channel, we have much longer and more in-depth videos on the history of 50s fashion, fashion in the 60s, and fashion in the 70s, and all the other fashion decades too. You can contact me through my website, amandahalley.com. Join our Facebook group. It's loads of fun. I'll be back soon, so click the little circle to subscribe to more from the Ultimate Fashion History. And as always, thanks for watching. Bye for now.